Sir Edmund was an undertaker when he first encountered the creatures. Not literally, of course. Undertaker was the curious name given to the settler colonial administrators installed in the Munster province of Ireland during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. The word may refer to the tasks these dignitaries had to undertake in order to discipline the population. It is axiomatic that the imperatives of their role would have entailed the services of the other sort of undertaker. About 4 centuries or so later, Dora Boyle takes the N7 from Dublin, merging into the M7 and M8 down to Cork, turning off onto the N72 to reach Mallow. As she drives southwest, her PhD supervisor's mellifluous scorn rings in her ears. "You mean to tell me you haven't even read the view of the present state of Ireland yet?" She has to admit she hasn't. Hardly the worst crime in history, since her thesis is supposed to be on the Fairy Queen and Elizabethan polity in the Munster Plantation. She can see why he thought this was a bit of an oversight. Still, he didn't need to be so supercilious about it. She'll show him. That's why she's brought it with her, to read as close as possible to Spenser's country pile, or what's left of it. In any case, Professor Keenan had no reason to be smug after what passed between them. "You're twice my age," she reminded him. "And what would your wife think?" "She needn't know," was his reply. "And as for the age gap, it never bothered Spenser." "This is the 21st century, not the 16th, she said, then left before he could start reciting the epithalamion at her or something. Maybe that's one of the reasons why she's made this trip, mobile phones switched off. It might also be one of the reasons he's become a bit sniffy about her work lately. A bit of a break from the hothouse atmosphere of Trinity is just what she needs, even without his unwanted attention. She drives along the narrow country roads through flat, open countryside. She frequently has to slow down for horses. Sometimes a white woman shape huddles demurely among the leaves, a roadside shrine to the Blessed Virgin. The sky is leaden, and fat raindrops soon begin spattering the windscreen, but she doesn't mind. The rhythmic whine of the windscreen wipers is soothing, if a little plaintive. "Help us, help us," it seems to say. A wretched land, damp and boggy. After spending what felt like half a lifetime in Munster, that was Sir Edmund's abiding impression of the place. But for someone who had to work his passage through merchant tailors, a castle of one's own wasn't something to sniff at. It was just that trotting along the roads at night could be somewhat hazardous, even with an armed escort to protect you. One never knew when an ambush might burst from the quiet trees whispering in the wind. Cut them down, raze them to the ground, sow it with salt. That would flush out the damn bandits. Talking of damnation, the whole place was riddled with popery and idolatry too. They might say they venerated the Mother of Christ, but make no mistake, they meant the Magna Mater, with all the licentiousness and degeneracy that implied. Might as well worship Circe. He wished he might call up Talos. Now there was a man who could flail some sense into them. There was some rumour going around that some of the papist forces wore helmets and breastplates that already bore the marks of a previous user. It was said that an old woman dwelled in the bogs and wandered them in search of food and firewood. When she came upon a dead English soldier, she would remove his armour and sell it to her compatriots. Sir Edmund imagined her clad in blackened rags, with an evilly pointed nose. He thought of the old ballad about the two crows dining upon a new slain knight. He'll sit on his white horse bane, and I'll pike out his bonny blue ane. Wi' ae lock o' his gowden hair, we'll thick our nest when it grows bare. He drove the Scotch gibberish out of his head. That was why it was essential to spread the English language as well as English ways. Ireland was a good example. No wonder the local population was so impudent and impious when they still clung stubbornly to their native tongue. When you speak Irish, you think Irish. As the darkness pressed upon his convoy, like the mantles some of those bandits wore to hide their faces, he couldn't help remembering the final stanza of that border ballad. Mony a one for him makes main, but none shall ken what he has gain. O'er his white banes, when they are bare, the wind shall blaw for evermore. Dora stops off at Doneraile to pick up the keys to the Airbnb from a gift shop on the high street. Smelling of scented candles, it's the only concession to tourists and features tea towels and other trinkets, some decorated with the ruins of Kilcolman Castle, others with something obscurer than this local landmark, handprints dotted around a patch of ashen ground. Good old-fashioned name, remarks the shopkeeper as she signs for the keys. It's short for Eudora. Grand, the shopkeeper says dryly. What's with the handprints? Oh, that's just the hand walker's marks, the woman says with a laugh, as if it's a silly question. When Dora looks at her quizzically, her only reply is to point to another tea towel design. On it is a reproduction of an old woodcut, showing what appears to be a man doing a handstand, but with a face that's the right way up and positioned between the legs that point skywards. Sir Edmund woke with a start and lay there sweating in his vast bed. Just another nightmare in which the things were crawling towards him through the woods, about the castle, moaning and gibbering. They were slow and weak with famine, but that did not matter. In dreams, one's own limbs were fashioned from lead. Besides, that wasn't the point. It was that these base creatures, dragging themselves like serpents through the mire, had human faces. At times like these he cursed his poetic sensibilities. He and Sidney had often discussed this problem. If only it were possible to instruct a gentleman in virtuous living, without the need to wrap it up in some pretty story rendered in verse. Then it were possible for them to live untroubled by their imaginations. He wondered if these human beasts would haunt him thus if he were not a poet. But he was an undertaker too. Perhaps it was part of his job to bury the past, or at least put it behind him. He smiled as he turned to his sleeping wife in the bed beside him, her sweet face childlike in slumber. Perhaps he should waken her and enjoy her favours, to put the terrors of the night from his mind. No, let her sleep. Such thoughts were put there by the devil. He often wondered if the wily Earl of Cork had given him his daughter as a distraction, to tempt him into the ways of popish licentiousness. But she was also a reminder, as the Queen's namesake, of his holy poetic purpose. A fit muse for him. Such was the duality of life. Later, the steward took him on a tour of the grounds, showing him the strange markings in the dirt. "Footprints, my lord," the man said. "Should I redouble the patrols?" "Not footprints, sirrah," Sir Edmund corrected him, pointing to the way the fingers splayed out, the thumbprints too. But the steward stared at them dumbly, stupidly, struggling to understand his meaning. Could the fool not see that these were prints of hands? "Your patrols will find nothing. Here's what you must do." It's not hard to find the cottage. There aren't many houses near Kilcolman. She finds some provisions and a note left by the Airbnb host, a Mrs. Fitzgerald. It's full of the kinds of instructions and admonitions she'd expect about the heating and the cooker and the recycling. But there's one rather unusual request. "You may find small animal corpses outside in the yard. Please don't touch them or throw them away. They'll be gone before you know it, so don't pay them any mind. All the best and have a wonderful holiday. Irene Fitzgerald." What an extraordinary thing to ask. She certainly has no intention of touching any dead animals. Apart from the bacon Mrs. Fitzgerald has considerately left for her in the fridge, along with some other fresh produce. Looking out of the window at the drizzling mist on the panes and the shrouding the land around the place, she won't be going outside today in any case. It seems like the perfect opportunity to sit down and read the view of the present state of Ireland at last. It's a good thing she's a captive audience here in the sticks. It isn't exactly a page-turner, just a tract about two blokes with Latin-sounding names discussing the cattle grazing customs of the Irish peasantry. Eudoxus argues that they're practical and sensible, making maximum use of the land available. But says Irenaeus, it encourages rebellion, criminality and insubordination. If it weren't for your backward Irish grazing practices, he argues, we could starve the outlaws out. Still, it's pretty dull stuff. In some ways, she can see why Professor Keenan wanted her to read it. When all his other advances failed, perhaps he was hoping to bore her into submission. Inside the copy he lent her, probably as an excuse to gaze at her with his pathetic old puppy dog eyes, he left a note inside the flyleaf saying, "For the attention of Dora Britomart." Ha! The token female knight in the Fairy Queen, who represents chastity. Funny how all of the virtues on offer. There's only one a woman can aspire to in Spenser's philosophy. She sees his game. The professor's, that is, the dirty old dog. And she can see Spenser's too, with the view. Irenaeus moves onto the wearing of mantles, another filthy habit, according to him. He's doing most of the talking by now. Poor old Eudoxus can hardly get a word in edgeways. It provides a disguise for your rebels, he says, a hiding place for weapons, and can act as a makeshift shelter for a miscreant on the run in a storm. Would have to be a pretty sturdy mantle, Dora thinks, looking out at the rain, sweeping more persistently now, past the window, to protect you against the Irish weather. But she sees a pattern emerging from this. It's what would now be called a culture war, quite literally. For Spenser, Irish culture, whether it's the language, the clothes, the agrarian practices, even the bloody weather, it's all a cloak for sedition. Basically, if you can't get them to bend the knee, you have to starve them into submission. Out of every corner of the woods and glens they came, creeping forth upon their hands. He writes of those starving after the Desmond Rebellion, for their legs would not bear them. They looked anatomies of death. They spoke like ghosts, crying out of their graves. They did eat of the carrions, happy where they could find them, yea, and one another soon after, insomuch as the very carcasses they spared not to scrape out of their graves. Spenser, or rather his author proxy Irenaeus, sounds as if he pities them, but his conclusion, calling the famine self-inflicted, makes it seem more like contempt. The drumbeat of the rain that the howling wind now hurls at the panes isn't quite enough to cover the sound of something dragging itself along the ground outside the front door of the cottage. Probably an animal, but a large one that sounds like it's at death's door. Perhaps she should investigate. But it's dark now, and horrible outside. She doesn't like the thought of any poor creature suffering, but she has no intention of going out there to look for it and nurse it back to health. She'll have a look in the morning.